Good evening. Thank you very much for joining our webinar, uh, what to do with your superannuation if you're an Australian living in the UK. My name is Kevin Tuck. I'm a financial advisor from BDH Sterling. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Paul Lawson-Tyers, who's an advisor like myself at BDH Sterling. He'll be co-presenting the webinar this evening. I hope you find it of interest and beneficial. And I'll pass you over to Paul now to start off the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Just before we start, we will be taking questions and answers at the end. There is a Q&A box rather than the chat box, so if you can put your questions in there, we will then endeavour to get through them at the end of the webinar. So first of all, just to introduce ourselves, BBH Sterling. We are dually licensed advisors in the UK and Australia. We specialise in helping people that are moving to Australia, Australians who are in the UK, planning for the future, either in the UK or for an eventual return to Australia. And we are defined benefit scheme specialists. So if you've got a defined benefit scheme, a commonly final salary type scheme, then we can help with that and working out what your options are when you're moving to Australia. We have offices in Australia. We have the 3 over there and we have 1 over here, and we can help you on both sides. So as you move from one country to another, and then when you're establishing yourself on the ground over in Australia and on a long-term basis if you want us to. So we can help with various different aspects. So Kevin, next slide please. Okay, so just taking you through how we go about retirement income planning. The first thing that we need to ask is a number of different questions about what exactly it is that you're saving for. So, for example, when and where do you want to retire? Are you going to be retiring in the UK? Are you going to be going to Australia in the future? And when are you going to do that? At what age? And we can help you to plan for that. Also, what do you want to do in retirement? You have some people that are quite happy just to spend a bit more time with friends and family. You have other people who want to buy a yacht and sail around the world. So clearly, when you're planning for somebody's retirement, you need to take into account different expenses that might come up in the future that surround that retirement, and trying to achieve the objectives for the client to make sure that they've got enough money to do what they want to do, to be able to retire at what age they want to retire at, to be able to buy those big ticket items when they want to. And we need to work out how long the money has to last. So although you can use average life expectancies to work out how long your retirement is likely to be, more and more people are living longer than that now, especially with medical advances, etc. So your chances of getting into much later retirement are a lot higher now than they would be in the past. So whereas you might be planning to retire at 65 and thinking you'd have a 20-year retirement ahead of you, we need to basically think, well, what if that retirement is actually more like 40 years? What if you reach 100? So we need to make sure that any planning that we're doing is realistic to what your retirement might look like. Next slide, please. So our starting point when we're working with clients is to do cash flow planning. So you may have done this with previous financial advisors before, or you might have done it in a different form when projecting company income and expenses. But essentially what we do is to plug all of your details into a piece of software, including all your financial details as they are at the moment, and we project everything forward. So, you know, how many more pension contributions are you going to pay? How much surplus income do you have each month, etc. So that we can work out what your future might look like in a very graphical form. So you'll see that in a moment. We'll show a couple of examples of that. But it basically maps out your future so that we can identify what needs to be done to try to achieve your goals. And along the way, we need to think about the shorter term planning as well. So for example, on the slide there, we've got university fees. So that might be something that you're saving for in the short term. So obviously we need to direct money into the right place to achieve your goal as to how much you need to get by that point. But also we need to take into account that that is then going to come out of your overall finances, because you will be spending it at a certain point to pay for those university fees. Same thing with a number of other items, building in, for example, the costs of moving back to Australia. They need to be built in because they will come out of your finances in due course. Buying new cars every 5-10 years. There's various different things that we can build into it to ensure that it is as realistic a plan as possible. And I say that, but when you're doing a plan, it may well look very different in 5-10 years time. So that's why we have to then monitor it as we go forward and ensure that it stays on track, and that anything that comes along the way in the meantime can also be catered for, can be included within that plan. So we'll show you a couple of examples, well, an example of how the plan can look. So next slide, please. So here you see that there's two different forecasts on there, same clients, but it shows at the top what their current situation looks like, and you'll see that towards the end of their retirements there's big patches of red. Now that indicates that they would actually be short of funds at that point to achieve their objectives. So we then need to look at what we can do to counter that. Can we redirect money, change investments, change the objectives? For example, might they retire at 65 rather than 60? Might they buy a smaller house in Australia when they move there? There's various different things that we can do, but it's mainly about making sure that the investments are set up in the right way to try to counter that. So if you look at the bottom one, it shows no red on there, and that's because a few things have been changed at the beginning of the plan. You see these spikes in blue there, which are money going into different places to try to achieve the long-term objective. And we need to look at various different scenarios in there. Now I've already mentioned about you might retire at a different age, you might buy a smaller house, you might taper back, rather than being a yacht that you sail around the world in, you might buy a smaller boat and just travel around Australia. There's various different things that we can consider in there, but also we can look at, well, what might the effects be of bad or good investments? What if investments perform differently to how we might expect them to? So we can stress test these cash flow planning models to look at what happens if there's, for example, a big market crash at the wrong time in your planning, and various other aspects like that, because that might affect the way that we plan the investments that we place. How much tolerance is there in there for investments to perhaps underperform, or if they do overperform, where might that money go? What might happen if you have a big increase in salary? There's various different things that we can put into there to try to come up with a plan that again looks realistic, but it's also giving you a good idea of what might happen in different scenarios, so that you can start to make the choices about what you need to do going forward. So next slide, please, Kevin. Okay, so just moving on to one area that we do help people a lot with, and that's with pensions. So in the two countries, Australia and the UK, there are two very different systems as far as pensions are concerned. So in the UK, you pay contributions into a scheme, you get tax relief on those contributions. The funds then grow in a tax-free environment, but if you are a UK resident, when you reach retirement, you get 25% back as a tax-free lump sum, and the rest is a taxable pension. In Australia, you don't get the same levels of tax relief. There are small amounts, i.e. it is taxed as it goes into the pension, but at maybe a lesser rate than if you received it as income. While the funds are in growth over there, they are taxed as they go along on that growth. But when you get to retirement, you can have everything tax-free from age 60. So it's a very different system. But that does present us with good opportunities. If your long-term aim is to move to Australia, then it gives us a good opportunity to look at the pension planning around that and making sure that you maximise what you can get out of it. So if you're paying contributions into the UK pension system and you're getting your tax relief on there, either 20% or maybe 40% tax relief on those contributions, then you get the tax-free growth over the years, and eventually we transfer it over to Australia, to an Australian superannuation fund, and you can get everything tax-free in retirement. So you never give back the tax relief that you got up front from HMRC. For once, you get one over on them. So it can be a really good way of contributing towards your future and getting a boost. Rather than it being 20%, 40% tax relief, it effectively becomes a much higher percentage than that when you consider that you will get the growth on it, you'll get everything tax-free at the end, compared to putting money into something like an ISA. ISAs have their place, especially if you're going to be in the UK for a long time and you're planning, for example, for those university fees, etc. But for the long-term retirement planning, if you're planning to move to Australia in the future, it can be a really good way of boosting your funds. And as I said, eventually getting it over to Australia, where you can also then get it into Australian dollars, which will suit your lifestyle a bit better. So that's basically pensions in a nutshell. It's a very complex area, but we do know what we're doing with it as far as what opportunities there are on both sides of the world. So I'll hand you back over to Kevin now, and he'll take you through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Paul. Retirement income. Just following on from Paul's point, identifying where your income will come from. Nowadays, people have various sources of income, not just pension income, ISAs, bonds, investment property, shares, and they're all taxed differently. So it's important to prioritise what order you take those different investments, withdrawals from those investments, to make sure that your arrangement is as tax efficient as it can be. Use of different tax wrappers. Australia and the UK have different tax wrappers, obviously, and the Australians don't always recognise the tax efficiency of investments in the UK and vice versa. I'll give you a quick example of that. ISAs are tax-free in the UK. However, if you withdrew them whilst in Australia, you would pay tax in Australia on any gain. So it's important to realise in the two jurisdictions how tax efficient your investments are in each country. Planning and advice is both crucial. Fundamentally, work out exactly how tax efficient you can be, and as I said on my previous slide, have an order of where you're going to take withdrawals from what pools of investments in the most tax efficient way. Okay, the value of advice, as Paul alluded to, we're independent financial planners. What are your objectives? What are your priorities? What are you looking to do? What are you looking to spend your money on? What level of income do you require over what period of time? A bespoke plan will give you that clarity and that structure, and have confidence that your plan will work. And once the plan is put into place and you're enjoying the lifestyle that you want, at BDH Sterling, you'll have ongoing regular reviews to make sure that your objectives are being met on an ongoing basis. So you'll have that confidence that once the plan has been set up, it's still fit for purpose moving forward. Why should you seek advice before making any decision? There's a lot of things which you can trip up on. Constant tax and superannuation changes in the UK and Australia. So specialist advice is obviously essential. when you're transferring pensions from the UK over to Australia, you have to ensure that those pension funds are compliant to UK legislation. If they're not, you could receive penalties of up to 55%. So by taking expert financial advice, we will obviously ensure that any provider that we recommend is fully compliant with HMRC. And lastly, if you're in Australia and you're looking to transfer some of your UK pensions over, you need to be aware of the schemes that you can and can't transfer to Australia. Typically, police force, fire brigade, army, and the teacher's pension, you can't transfer over. With those types of schemes, they never build up a particular value. So as they're government backed, unfortunately you can't transfer them. But part of the advice process, we will look at, what's available to transfer and to make sure that the funds are compliant. Reversing direction. This is a very valid slide because a lot of people that we speak to may not know where they're going to end up. They may well want to remain in the UK, or at some point want to move back to Australia, or flip between the two. It's a common question that we get asked, and it's a common it's integral to the plan that we put together for our clients on where they're going to end up. If you are, if you do move to say to Australia and you come back to the UK at some point, you have to stay in Australia for 5 years to benefit from any of the tax regime in Australia. So by getting the tax relief, as Paul said, on the pensions which are tax-free, you have to be resident there for 5 years before you come back. Otherwise, you'll lose some of that tax status. Superannuation access, the preservation age is now between 60 and 65. If you were born after July 64, the preservation age will be 60, and depending on the release conditions, if you are fully retired and you've met your preservation age, then you'll have full access to your superannuation, regardless whether you're in the UK or in Australia. The superannuation funds can't be transferred back, unfortunately. What we do look at is we can do some research and analysis of your superannuation scheme to make sure that the risk that you're taking within that fund is acceptable to your tolerance to risk, and we can ensure that the asset allocation and the underlying funds are appropriate to your needs. Superannuation will be taxed on a remittance in the UK. There are some strategies to mitigate tax. If you sort of want a better term, if you open up the bonnet of your superannuation scheme and you looked underneath, what you would find is there are components which are taxable and there are components which are tax-free. At BDH, we can calculate which component is tax-free and which is taxable for you, and then put a withdrawal strategy in place to help meet your objectives on that basis. The withdrawals within the superannuation have to be taken in equal percentages. So if you want to take 20% of the tax-free component out as a withdrawal, you'll have to take 20% of the taxable component as well. So it just highlights how essential advice is, so you don't get tripped up with the tax man, so to speak. Reversing direction, as I said before, a lot of people that we speak to, a lot of our clients don't ultimately know when they're going to end up. They've got some idea. If you're domiciled here in the UK and you have Australian assets, HMRC will charge inheritance tax on your worldwide assets if you're domiciled here in the UK. So anything you have in the UK, anything you have in Australia will be deemed as your worldwide assets, and you'll be charged inheritance tax by UK HMRC. If you're move over to Australia and you're domiciled eventually in Australia, there's no inheritance tax within Australia. However, if you do keep any UK assets, investment property, etc., like here in the UK, that will be charged. If you take your, as Paul alluded to, if you take your superannuation whilst resident in Australia, it's all tax-free. And it's important that if you're going to flip between the two at some point in the future when you retire, that you optimize your status for tax purposes, and that's different for everybody's circumstances. Just so we can help you work out what's best for you and where to be classified as resident. Just before we go on to the Q&A, I'll just put our email address up. If you wanted to have a further conversation on a one-to-one basis with myself or Paul, please feel free to get in touch. It would be great to discuss these topics in a bit more detail. And I'll just pass over to the Q&A. As Paul said, if you can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We have one, is a local government pension scheme, local council transferable to Australia. So if I could pass that one over to Paul, if I may.
Yeah, so Kevin noted a few different schemes that can't be transferred. I'll give you the full list of those ones, which are NHS, teachers, police, armed forces, firefighters, and civil service. Now, the reason that they can't be transferred, and this has only been since 2015, when the UK government brought in flexibility to how you can draw personal pension type arrangements in the UK, in terms of you can draw anything up to 100%, although it would be largely taxable. But you can have that flexibility now. So what was happening is that a lot of people in old final salary type schemes were looking to move into that more flexible environment to draw for their retirement. And the UK government were a bit concerned about certain government-backed schemes, not only from the level of transfer requests that they could potentially have, but also they were concerned that people might not realise the value of the benefits that they were giving up in those schemes. So they basically placed a blanket ban on those government-backed schemes that were classed as unfunded. And what they meant by unfunded is that they don't have a separate ring-fenced fund for those particular schemes. You pay contributions, but it just goes into the general government coffers, if you like, and they can budget each year on how much they're likely to pay out as benefits. With the local government pension scheme, you will notice when you're a member of the local government pension scheme that it will be called something else. It falls under the banner of the local government pension scheme, but for example, we have the West Midlands pension scheme and the West Yorkshire pension scheme and the Greater Manchester pension scheme, all falling under the local government pension scheme and all being subject to the same type of rules. But they are separate funds that are individually funded. And as a result of that, they're not a problem. They are running very much like a normal company final salary, or well, they're not all final salary schemes these days, career average revalue earnings type schemes, things like that. But defined benefit schemes is the banner that they come under. And those ones that have a ring-fenced fund, like the occupational schemes and the local government pension scheme, can produce transfer values. So that's a long answer to your question, but I just wanted to give you and those other people that are listening that might be members of those schemes that they can't transfer from some context as to why that situation has arisen.
Thank you, Paul. We have another question. I know that someone can earn for 180 days while overseas from a UK contract of employment. Is there a workaround to live in Australia while earning a UK income? The short answer to that is It's where you're based from a residency for tax purposes. So if you're earning a UK income whilst in Australia, it'll be where you're actually paying tax. So if you're paying tax in the UK, then you'll be a UK taxpayer. If you're in Australia earning a UK income but paying tax by your Australian tax return, then you'll be classified as an Australian resident for tax purposes. We do have a part of our company called BDH Tax, whereby if there's any specific tax queries that myself and Paul get on a daily basis, we can lean on them for some help, advice if someone's got a specific tax question. So please bear in mind that, you know, if there's any questions that myself and Paul possibly can't answer this evening or moving forward, we do have some tax experts who are qualified in the UK and in Australia. I believe they're based in Melbourne, aren't they, Paul? BDH
They are,
Tax?
yes.
They are.
Yes. Well, they're based in Melbourne, but they also have people in other offices out there. Like, for example, we do have a BDH Tax representative in Brisbane, whereas we don't have a BDH Sterling office in Brisbane. But so they do work as a sister company to us effectively. But they are duly qualified accountants. We're duly qualified financial advisors, and there is a bit of a crossover between the two jobs. There is a bit of an area in the middle where we each know a bit about each other's jobs, but sometimes there's certain specific things that definitely fall into one camp or another. And even with some clients, there are some pieces of work that we do for the clients that fall in the financial planning arena, like pensions and investments and things like that. Whereas there's others that would be better served by BDH Tax as a separate piece of work, because, you know, things like, for example, shutting down companies and extracting profits and those with multiple properties that they're looking to retain. It's about, you know, managing that and making sure that you get the right tax breaks on it, etc. And they can actually help you to complete your tax returns in both countries. When I say about tax returns in both countries, obviously in the UK, if you're employed and you don't have anything that needs to go on a tax return, then you don't have to complete one. In Australia, everybody completes a tax return.
Thanks, Paul. Another question. There's no IHT in Australia, as we all know, and trusts are generally targeted for tax avoidance. So as the Australian planning on buying a property in the UK, I had not focused on the impact of UK inheritance tax. Generally speaking, should I fully investigate the cost, benefit and risk trade-offs of buying a UK property through a trust? I'll pass that one back over to Paul as well, if I may.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer really without knowing more about your overall situation, John. Yeah, I mean, inheritance tax has to form part of the planning. But there was a politician, I can't remember who it was, but somebody, I think back in the 80s, who made the comment that inheritance tax was the only tax that you paid through choice. And what he meant by that is, you know, clearly if you're earning £100,000, then you're going to pay income tax, you know, at a higher level of tax, and there's nothing you can do about that. That's just the way it works. And various other taxes as well, like capital gains tax and things like that, although you can manage that to a certain extent, it's still a tax that's going to be there. Whereas with inheritance tax, there are ways to set up your affairs in such a way that either your estate is not liable to inheritance tax, or if it is, that there's things in place that can pay for it, basically. So basically what he was saying is that inheritance tax should not really deplete somebody's estate at the end of the day, that they pass over to their beneficiaries, unless they haven't set up their affairs in the right way. So what I mean by that is, obviously a trust could potentially work, but as you rightly say, it may not work once you move to Australia if you're still holding that property. There are other methods that people can use if their inheritance tax liability isn't particularly high, or even if it is particularly high, depending on their age and their health and things like that. For example, a life assurance policy might work well. If you're jointly holding your assets, then maybe a life assurance policy that's set up on a joint life second death basis, so that it pays out only when the second of you dies, and that's when there would be inheritance tax to pay on the estate, because usually assets pass from one spouse to another without any inheritance tax being liable at that point. So you could set up a life assurance policy, and it could cover you for as long as you're likely to be deemed domiciled in the UK for inheritance tax purposes. So for those people that are just in the process of moving over to Australia now and have an inheritance tax liability, it may well be that a policy for a 3-year term might be suitable. I was talking to a client of mine about this earlier on this week. He's 66 years old. And in general, if you get a life assurance policy for a 66-year-old, it might be quite expensive. But he only needs it for 3 years. And as a result of that, a 3-year policy, from the life assurer's point of view, on a joint life basis, the chances of both of them, who are similar ages, both of them passing away within the next 3 years, well under life expectancy, means that they don't actually see it as a massive liability, and the premiums aren't as expensive as you might think. So I'm not saying that you should set up a life insurance policy. I'm not saying that you shouldn't use a trust. As I said, John, I don't know enough about your situation, but it just goes to show that there are certainly ways to look at inheritance tax that mean that you don't necessarily have to change your plans. You just have to plan around those plans, if you like.
Thanks, Paul. We have another question regarding UK ISAs. Will I be taxed? You'll be taxed on the withdrawals. If so, would you therefore draw down your ISAs before moving so they are not taxed? That is correct. If you move over to Australia and keep your, say, stocks and shares ISAs in the UK, and then at some point in the future you cash them in, any growth you'll put on your Australian tax return and pay tax at your marginal rate. If, however, you cash them in before you leave the UK, then any cash you take over to Australia will be tax-free. The other option that you do have, because some people don't necessarily want to cash them in, they like the idea of having an investment, albeit it's not recognised as a tax-free investment in the UK as in Australia. You have an option with offshore bonds, whereby if you invested money in an offshore bond and then those offshore bonds took to Australia with you, after 10 years of being a resident in Australia, they would effectively become tax-free. So if you wanted the money stay invested, but the ISA wasn't the most tax efficient way of doing it, then you do have some other options for you.
I'm just going to go back to a previous question, actually, Kevin, from Nicole. Yeah. If I plan to retire in Australia, should I opt out of the NHS pension? I'm about to start with them in 2022. Well, again, it's not really a question that I can answer without knowing more about your situation. But having said that, it's not necessarily the case that would be the best option for you. The NHS pension, like a lot of other pensions, has gone through a lot of changes over the years, but it's still essentially these government-backed pensions are still gold-plated pensions, if you like. They're about as good as you can possibly get. So, you know, if you're likely to be still in the UK for a good few years, then, you know, you will most likely build up benefits within that scheme at a higher level than you might be able to achieve elsewhere. Yes, you can't transfer it over to Australia, but what we mean by that is that you can't take a transfer value from that scheme and transfer it over to an Australian superannuation plan before you start drawing on it. You would still be able to draw your income from that scheme. You'd still get that from the NHS pension scheme when you reach this scheme retirement age, but it will be subject to tax in Australia. Whether you'll actually pay tax will depend on what other taxable assets you have at that point, because, you know, as I said, superannuation funds will come out to you tax free. So it's really a case of, well, you know, do you have UK state pension, for example, and do you have property income and things like that, because you may well not actually pay tax on it, but you will have to manage the exchange rate on an ongoing basis. But it is guaranteed income, at least in sterling terms, and having a base of guaranteed income is usually quite useful in your retirement planning, because it takes the risk, the onus off of those other assets that you've got to provide with your retirement income for you. So yeah, that's not saying that you should stay in the NHS pension scheme or you should opt out of it. It's not really something that we can say on here. You know, it would be an advice piece, if you like.
Thanks, Paul. Another question regarding superannuation withdrawals. If I have a superannuation in Australia and draw it down post 60 whilst living in the UK, how will my super drawdowns be taxed in the UK? Okay, so if you reach preservation age and you're fully retired and you start to take withdrawals from your super, if you take it as an income or take them as withdrawals, they are taxed differently. If you set up, say, a monthly withdrawal, you'll be taxed more than if you took withdrawals, say, on an annual basis, because the annual withdrawals aren't classified as income. They're actually classified as withdrawals because they're not deemed to be regular. So that is the first point to consider. Secondly, if you qualify for foreign service relief, that means that a part of your superannuation will be tax-free. The balance will be taxable here in the UK. What we have to be careful of, as I said in one of the previous slides, if you wanted to take a percentage out of the tax-free pot, you have to take the same percentage out of the taxable pot. So we would work out from your earnings that, say, for example, it would meet your objective by making a withdrawal, but didn't push you into the high rate tax bracket. So that's a quite a long-winded way of saying that part of it will be tax-free, part of it will be taxable, and then we can work out that by giving you the withdrawal that you need to meet your objectives, you're keeping within your basic rate band. We have one regarding exchange rates on large sums of money, Paul. If I could ask you to answer that one.
So the question is, do you do exchange rates for large sums of money? Well, the simple answer is no, but we know somebody who can. So it's an area that we work with a lot, because obviously we're dealing with people that have assets in sterling a lot of the time, and they need to convert them over to Australian dollars or vice versa. So we do work with currency brokers all the time. We're not actually currency brokers ourselves, but we work with currency brokers on a close basis. We use them for a large number of clients, whether it be their personal funds or their pension funds. We can actually build in a currency broker into a pension fund. So if you're moving to Australia and you've got UK pensions and you're not quite ready to transfer them over to Australia, either because you're not old enough to do so, or you're not, or there are limits on how much you can transfer into a superannuation fund each year. So you may well have to drip feed it over a number of years, but we can build in a currency broker into a pension scheme so you can move into dollars whenever you like. And the good thing about the fact that we work with these currency brokers for large sums of money with the pension funds and people's house proceeds and things like that, it means that we do generally get a good deal on that for our clients. So what I mean by a good deal is, with currency brokers, they buy buy currency at a certain rate, the interbank rate it's called. They will sell it to you at a lesser rate, and it's that difference, that spread between those, which is where they make their money, rather than transactional fees. But that spread is a lot tighter with currency brokers in general than it would be through a bank, for example. But it's also tends to be a little bit tighter for our clients, particularly, as I said, if they're dealing with large sums of money. So yeah, it's essentially we do work with currency brokers, but we're not a currency broker ourselves.
Thanks, Paul. Do you want to take the last question on? Is there any restrictions on transferring Australian pensions to the UK as they were going the other way? I'm thinking about PSS government scheme.
Well, as Kevin alluded to earlier, you can't transfer Australian pensions to the UK, i.e. you can't take the fund value and transfer it into a UK pension scheme. It doesn't work like that because the Australian authorities don't allow a transfer out of the country. And it's always a big consideration particularly when we've got British people who are moving over to Australia for the first time. It is making sure that their intentions are to remain in Australia before we start moving funds from a UK pension into an Australian superannuation fund, because once it's there, it can't be transferred back. If they've reached superannuation age and preservation age of 60 over there, they could potentially draw out the funds before they return to the UK, depending on whether they've been outside the UK for more than 5 years at that point, because otherwise there could be tax implications of that. But if you've got an Australian pension that's been built up from living over there and you're living in the UK long term, then that's when that planning comes into account, which Kevin was talking about in terms of, what's the taxable element, what's the tax-free element, how do you plan around that to keep things within your tax rates, and how do you plan around it from a currency point of view and things like that. So yeah, that basically you can't transfer from one pension to another. You can still draw it, and then it comes down to how you go about doing those withdrawals.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just see if there's any other questions come up on the Q&A.
Nothing.
Anybody has?
I'd say if you've got another question, please ask as quickly as possible, because otherwise we might wrap things up.
Well, I've got the on the screen, I've got our email address. So if you'd like to speak about this topic in further detail, please feel free to email in, and myself or Paul will arrange a call with you. Thanks for joining us. Hope you found it beneficial. It's that time of year again. I've got the tree behind me. So I'd just like to say, if I don't speak to you before Christmas, have a safe, healthy and happy Christmas. Good night.
Yes, Merry Christmas, everyone.